Hey Flight Test friends, in this section we're going to take everything that you have learned up till now and we're going to be making some tail assemblies. Now we're going to be doing some single segment and some multi-segments. I think you're really going to enjoy how all of this comes together. We're going to be taking some symbols that you are familiar with, and then we're going to also be introducing some new ones. The reason that we are not doing specific segments for these new symbols is they work in combination with some of the earlier ones. You ready to have some fun? Let's get started. The first assembly we're going to be looking at is a single segment tail section. Now if you look from here to here, we actually have all the skins necessary to build a Trojan aircraft. And before I start concentrating on the tail section, I want to point something out. If you look over here, I've got numbers way over here on one side. Here, 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 and here. Make sure when you're laying this out and preparing for assembly that all the numbers are on one side. If you look at this part, if I flip it around the other way, it looks pretty close, but at a glance you can tell that it's not oriented correctly because we've got all the numbers on this side except this one. So make sure that whenever you're forming these parts that the numbers always end up on one side of the seam. Let's move these extra parts off to the side and let's go ahead and build the tail section. When doing the tail section in this segment, we're going to start from the very beginning. I want you to see these symbols used in conjunction with one another. The more you see these symbols used, I feel like this is going to become more and more intuitive. Hopefully, after a couple builds, you're not even going to need to watch the videos to assemble the aircraft. So let's take a look at these three formers. You can see that we've got an F4, an F4, and an F4. We just need to get these in the correct order. So we've got the first one, the second one, and the third one. So it looks like our order's good. We're simply going to glue the three pieces together. Make sure when gluing these together that you keep the glue away from the area where it says no glue. As the glue's cooling down, make sure all the crop marks are aligned at the bottom and here at the top. We'll set this off to the side and work on the spline. So on the spline here at the back, we've got a couple symbols that indicate we need to tear the foam away from the paper. Now we're going to look at the stack symbol. And since we've got a letter M, we're going to know that the symbols face outward from one another. Let's do a test fit. Okay. You can see I've got the symbol on this side and the symbol on this side. That looks good, so let's glue it together. Making sure everything is aligned correctly. Add a little bit of pressure, smooth everything out, and we'll set this off to the side to cool off. So let's turn our attention to the skin itself. If you look here in the middle, you're going to see a peel symbol. Now we've already gone over that. We know what that symbol means. But if you look right above it, you're going to see a star. A star indicates that this is the part that you're going to start with when creating an assembly. Many of the parts get created and then additional segments are added on. So anytime you see a star, you know that's going to be the starting point. The circle indicates that this is going to be a closed shape. Anytime you see a circle, you will be adding glue. Since this is going to be a tail section, we're going to be removing the paper, adding shape, and bringing these edges together to be glued. If you look up here on the very edge, you're going to see our former symbol. What that former symbol means is once we get this shape formed, we're going to be sliding a former in place. You can see that I've got an F4. F4 indicates the former that will be squeezed inside of this tail section. And so you can see right here, we've got F4. Now that we've briefly gone over the symbols, let's remove the paper from the foam. To remove the paper, just grab a corner and pull the paper across. Bonus points if it comes off in one piece. Once we get the paper off, it's time to add some shape. I want to spend a moment or two talking about how to add shape to the skin specific to the former that we're going to be inserting. You'll notice this former is for a T28, so it's kind of flat on the sides, but it's really rounded here on top, and it's really rounded here on the two corners at the bottom. So I'm going to turn this upside down and lay it against the foam. And from about here to here, I'm going to be adding most of my shape here at the top. I've got a magic marker here, so I'm going to put a small mark here and a small mark here. So if I roll my former, you can see that that mark starts about where this former gets flat. So I'm going to be adding shape down the middle from here, and I'm going to have it taper as it goes to the back of the skin. Over here on the edges, I'm going to take this center mark and I'm going to line it up to the edge. And I'm going to put a mark here. I'm going to roll my former to just where it starts flattening out. I'm going to put a second mark. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Taking a few extra moments to mark the zones where you're going to be adding shape is going to give you a lot better end product. I'm going to make a dotted line. I'm going to go from the leading edge all the way to the trailing edge. That's where I'm going to add my shape in the middle, and I'm going to do the same down here. And again, these lines are almost going to come together here at the back. And there's nothing exact here. These lines are just going to kind of help me make sure that I'm adding shape in the right area. Once I get my zones marked, I'm going to flip my part over, and we're going to line up this bottom line here in the center along the edge of the table. I'm going to lay my hand across and draw the part down with a good firm pressure. Once I've got a little shape added, I'm going to take and flex apart just a little bit. I want to make sure that I'm not creating any dents or bends, so I'm not pressing too hard. Once I've done that a few times, I'm going to find my line, and I'm going to line it up to the edge of the table, and we're going to begin doing the same thing. Firm pressure, I'm going to draw down. Firm pressure, draw down. And you'll notice that each time I draw down, I'm moving my hand over just a little bit. Once I've got the shape roughed in, I'm going to push the skin up against the edge of the table, and I'm going to bend it over with my fingertips. This is going to help sharpen this edge from here all the way to the back. I'm going to flip it around and do the same on the other side. Once that's done, I am going to add a little bit of shape here in the middle. Not a whole lot like I've done down the middle and on either edge, but there is a little bit of roundness right through here. That ought to get it. Just a pass or two is all you'll need. Now that we've got some shape added, let's try bringing the two edges together. I've got quite a bit of resistance, especially down here at the bottom. So what I want to do is I want to break down the foam a little bit more here and here. What I'm going to do is, using my fingertips, I'm going to gently bend this edge back. I want to be very careful not to create any wrinkles or creases. I can also lift the skin up and gently bend it over. The longer you work the foam, the easier these two edges are going to be to bring together. Really take your time with this step. You really want to try to avoid wrinkles if at all possible. I'm using firm pressure, but I'm not pressing down hard enough that I'm creating creases. I'm going to hold this for a minute or so, then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Holding it in place will really allow that foam to break down. Just like before, I'm going to hold this in place for a minute or two. Let's bring the edges together a second time and let's see if it's any easier. That is much, much better. I don't think I'm going to need to work the foam anymore, so I'm going to tear off some tape and we're going to lay a piece of tape across the seam so we can start gluing things together. Now that I've got my tape on standby, I'm going to add a piece of tape right here in the middle. I'm going to run the tape all the way up to the edge, and then I'm going to fold it backwards. Next, I'm going to bring the two edges together. I want to make sure up here that the two corners are lined up exactly. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to carefully lay the tape right across the seam. With the tape across the seam, you can see we've got these two edges in close proximity to one another. I'm going to lay a heavy bead of glue down one of the edges. I'm not going to worry about going all the way down to the tape. Once I get the glue in place, I'm going to push the side with glue down just slightly. And then I'm going to bring the other side down in kind of a scissoring motion. That scissoring motion is going to push the excess glue to the inside. I'm going to hold it in place for a few seconds, and I'm going to apply a piece of tape as soon as I can. Let's let the glue cool down for a minute, and then we're going to work our way backwards. Now that we've got the front of the tail section glued together, let's glue up the back. I'm going to lay a couple pieces of tape right up to the seam, and I'm going to fold them backwards. And just like we did before, I'm going to run a bead of glue along one edge. You can see that I'm laying a pretty heavy bead of glue. The edge that has glue, I'm going to push in slightly more, and then I'm going to wipe downward with the other side, pushing the excess glue to the inside. Bring the two edges together, and I'm going to pull my tape across the seam. You can see I'm using my fingers to push directly down on the seam, and I'm going to pull the tape across. Now that we've got this side glued and this side glued, we just need to add a small bead of glue down the middle. I'm going to peel the tape back, and from the inside I'm going to push just slightly, creating an opening. We're just going to squirt just a little bit of glue in there. Make sure that your fingers are not directly on the seam. You don't want to get burned on this step. If you end up with some excess glue, you can wipe it away using a piece of scrap foam. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to do a test fit between the former and the skin. One thing I want to point out is you'll notice that the shape of the skin is very close to the shape of the former. Laying out these zones takes a little bit of extra time, but it will really pay off. It'll give you a much, much better finished product. So let's try fitting the former into the skin. I can already tell that it's going to be a little bit too tight. I could force it, but I would rather have a former fit more on the loose side than the tight side. So there's a couple different ways that we can make this former fit a little bit better. We can take a razor blade and we can cut around the edge, and we may have to do that, but there's something a little bit simpler that we can do. I can lay the former on the tabletop and press down and roll it all the way around the edge. By crushing the outer edge of the former, we ought to have a little bit better fit. I'm going to run it around a second time. You'll also notice that I'm holding my former at a slight angle. The reason I'm doing that is the tail section tapers down just slightly, so I'm trying to mimic that taper. Okay, let's check the fit. Look at that, drops right in. So our test fit looks good. I want to make sure that this crop mark here at the bottom lines up exactly with the seam on the bottom of the skin. Once I'm happy with the fit, I'm going to pull the former out. I'm going to apply glue to the inside of the skin, and then we're going to reinsert the former. You'll notice that my former has been pushed in where one layer of foam is still sticking out. You'll want to make sure that it is sticking out evenly all the way around. So let's pull that out. We're going to apply a heavy bead of glue. And we're going to reinstall the former. I'm checking to make sure that my lines are lined up correctly. I'm going to push it in a little more at the top so that I have one layer of foam sticking out all the way around. As it's cooling down, I'm going to watch to make sure I don't have any big bubbles popping up. That looks good. We'll hold it in place for a couple minutes while that glue has a chance to cool. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, I want to talk for just a minute about this cut symbol. The cut symbol instructs us to make a cut on the dashed line after the assembly has been completed. This is just one example of how the cut symbol will be used. It will also be covered in other videos. Using a razor blade, I'm going to follow the dashed line from the top to the bottom. Since I'm going through multiple layers of foam, I'll probably have to do this 3 or 4 times. Once you cut all the way through, remove all the material between the dotted lines. Once a cut's been made, we can try a test fit with our spline. One thing I want to point out, when you're doing your test fit, if the spline is really dragging, you can always run a razor blade down either side and open this slot up just a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to flip the assembly around. You can see that I'm almost flush. Looks like I need to go another 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to lift this up. I'm just going to hold the bottom. I'm not going to squeeze because I don't want to crinkle the foam. I'm going to push just slightly until it stops. Our fit looks good. You'll see that the spline is off to one side. We're going to pull it out here in just a second and add some glue. But when we reinsert it, it's very important that that is exactly centered. So looking at this, I know it's wanting to go off to one side, so I'm really going to watch that after I add glue. So I'm going to flip it back on its end and place 2 fingers on the former, and I'm going to pull straight up. Once I do that, I'm going to apply a heavy bead of glue here on the top and a heavy bead of glue here on the bottom. Once I do that, we're going to reinsert. You can see that I'm dropping glue on the table, so I want to make sure not get my hand in it. I also want to make sure I'm not getting the tail section in the glue. Point it straight up, push it down. Here at the back, looks like I'm good and centered. I want to flip it around. And I've got a little bit of glue squirting out there at the top. Using a piece of scrap, I want to wipe that away and wipe away the excess there on the bottom. I'm going to set this assembly off to the side. It's always a good idea to let it dry completely before trying to remove it. If you try to remove it when it's hot, it'll smear and it's much, much more difficult to wipe it from your tabletop. Let's run a bead of glue between the spline and the former. Do the same on the other side. We'll give that about 30-45 seconds to cool, and then we're going to add push rod housings. Next, we're going to install our first push rod housing. I'm going to run the push rod housing through this hole, and I'm going to run it back until I can see it in this pill-shaped slot here at the back. Using a push rod, I'm going to catch the opening. Once I catch the opening, I'm going to run my push rod in 4 or 5 inches. I'm going to lift up, and I'm going to give the push rod housing a little push, and you can see that it's coming out about 1/4 inch. I'll add a little glue right here. And I'm going to add a little glue on the other end, just like that. We'll let that cool for about a minute, and then we're going to cut it off and do the same thing on the other side. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, using a razor blade, I'm going to put a small cut on one side and then break it 90 degrees. Right, now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. The next thing I want to do is I want to apply a bead of glue between the spline and the skin. I want to do that on both sides. Once I get the glue in place, I'm just going to squeeze this together and hold for a couple minutes. Make sure you give the glue plenty of time to cool down on this step. Now that the spline has been secured on both ends, this is a good time to cut this slot for the horizontal stabilizer. Now, not all tail sections will have this, but if you see dotted lines, let's go ahead and make that cut. Whenever you're making the cut, you want to hold the razor blade really flat. Notice I'm keeping the razor blade parallel to the table. Now that we've finished the single segment tail section, let's move on to the two segment tail section. So if you look at the parts we have laid out here, you'll see that the spline is broken up into two pieces. Instead of having one skin like we did in the previous portion, we have two. You'll also see that we have two sets of formers. Let's begin with gluing the formers together. So reading my symbol mapping, I need 3 of the F4s. There's the first, there's the second, and there's the third. We've already got them in the correct order. Just like before, I'm going to apply glue except down the middle as indicated by the symbol mapping. We'll set this off to the side and let's check the next one. So we got the first, the second, and here we've got the third. Now you'll notice that we've got the letter M. Anytime we see the letter M, we're going to flip it upside down. So that's the order we need to glue them in. Let's add some glue. While the glue's cooling down, keep an eye on the crop marks. You want to make sure everything stays aligned. As I'm examining the symbol mapping on this side, I notice that I've got a bevel that goes all the way around this side. Once the glue's cooled down, we'll add that bevel using a razor blade. Once a bevel's been cut, let's move on to the spline. Before we move on, I want to take a couple minutes to discuss the symbol mapping on the splines. You can see we've got quite a bit going on. So let's just break things down before we glue anything together. Over here we've got the stack symbol. We're going to be stacking an H1 with an H1. We see that there's a letter M. So that tells us that the symbols are going to be facing outward from one another. They're going to be fitting together just like that. If you look here, we've got a bevel start, and here we've got a bevel stop. So once we glue everything together, we're going to need to add a bevel on this side. We're also going to need to add a bevel on that side. You can see where we've got the peel foam symbol. So we're going to know that we need to peel the foam away. Again, we're going to do that after everything's glued together. Here we've got a new symbol. This is our edge-to-edge symbol. Once we get everything glued up, we're going to talk a little more about that one. Let's go ahead and glue the two halves together. I'm going to run my glue all the way down to the end. Well, that's cooling down. I'm going to take the back side of my razor blade and I'm going to run it down the score. And I'm going to break away this chunk of foam. Flip it over and do the same on the other side. Next, I'm going to cut my bevel. Flip it over and do the same on the other side. Let's set this part off to the side. Now we're going to do the spline marked H2. Looking at our symbols, we're going to be stacking two parts, H2 and H2 together. Because there's a letter M, that means they're going to be mirrored, and the inscriptions are going to be facing outward from one another. So parts are going to be glued together just like that. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to check my alignment, and I'm going to hold this in place for about a minute. Now that we have the splines complete, I want to talk about the edge-to-edge symbol located on the splines. This is one example of how the edge-to-edge symbol will instruct the builder to bring two edges together. Edge-to-edge symbols along a curved piece will be covered in a later video. Edge-to-edge symbols will always be accompanied by alphanumeric markings similar to other components. The markings will instruct the builder which part or parts will be glued edge to edge. In this instance, we will be gluing the H1 spline to the H2 spline. We will be applying glue to one edge or the other, and we will simply be matching up the edges. Before we glue the spline, we will first be building the two tail segments. We'll actually be attaching the two spline segments in a couple minutes. In this portion of the video, we're going to cover the two-part multi-segment tail section. Let's begin by examining the symbol mapping. This is going to help us put together a good game plan so that we have the best looking part possible. We see the star right here. This means that we're going to start with this part. We see that we're going to be peeling the paper from the foam, and since we have a complete circle, that means there's going to be glue involved. We're going to be rolling this over and gluing this edge to this edge. Now let's look down here. I see that the part C6 is underlined. Since the part is underlined, this is the part we're working on. I see the former symbol right here. So C6 is going to be attached to a former labeled F5. So you'll see right here, I've got the F5 former. Now that we've discussed the symbols, let's begin by removing the paper from the foam. Now that we've got the paper removed, let's read the former so that we know where to add shape to the skin. So if we look at this F5 former, we can see that we're going to be adding a whole lot of shape right up here at the top. The sides are relatively flat, but once we get down here to the bottom, we've got a pretty tight curve. So with that in mind, I'm going to take my black magic marker. I'm going to center the former. I'm going to line up this crop mark with this crop mark. And I'm going to roll the former until it starts to flatten out. It's about right here. I'm going to roll it the other way. And it's about right here. Just make sure it's pretty even. It doesn't have to be exact. Now I'm going to draw a line towards a trailing edge. And it's going to come almost to a point. You don't have to worry about being neat on this step. All this is going to be hidden inside the aircraft. Okay, so this zone right here is where we're going to be adding all the shape here on the top of the tail section. To map out this, we're going to take the crop mark here in the center, and I'm going to line it up to the edge, and I'm going to roll the former to about there. That's about where it flattens out. I'll do the same on the other side. Line up the crop mark to the edge and roll it, and we're going to put a mark there. I'm going to draw a line so I know about where I need to work. Right, let's start adding some shape. What I'm going to do, I'm going to line up this lower line on the edge of the table. Apply a small amount of pressure and start working that area. The more time you take breaking down the foam on the underside, the easier this part will be to form when it comes time to glue it. Now that I've worked that a little bit, I'm simply going to take and I'm going to bend it gently. I want to make sure that I'm not applying pressure to the point where I'm adding crinkles or creases to the skin. I want to make sure my tabletop is clean. I want to make sure I don't have any blobs of glue that'll dent the skin. I'm going to lay it flat and very gently break the foam down a little bit more. Again, you got to be very careful not to put creases and dents in the foam. All right, once that's done, I'm going to line up the edge of the table along this line. And you can see I'm just making a small break. I'm going to draw it off the table a little bit and create a second break. I'm not pushing it down 90 degrees, I'm just making some small breaks. We're going to come back and do this a number of times. I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick this up, but you're going to see some very distinct lines where we made one break and then the next break and then the next break. The way you get rid of those is once you've made those breaks, you can take your hand, apply pressure, and draw it off the edge of the table. Kind of smooths them up. Next what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the edge on the table and I'm going to gently roll the skin. Just like before, we want to be real careful not to apply too much pressure where we create dents, creases, or wrinkles. The longer you hold this, the easier the gluing will be when it comes time to bring the two edges together. Now let's flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. Just like we did on the other side, I'm going to take the reference line that I drew and line it up to the edge of the table. And I'm going to create a series of breaks using my fingertips. I'm going to push the edge down onto the table and gently fold the entire skin over to really break down that foam on the inside. One thing I really like about the multi-segment tail sections is even though there are a lot more parts, they are much easier to do than the single sections. The reason being is the single sections are generally very long, and the longer the piece is, the harder it is to roll. The multi-segments, since they're shorter, are a cinch compared to the singles. The sides are not perfectly flat. They've got a little bit of curve to them. So we're just going to spend just a little bit of time and attention from about here back to about here. That'll be plenty. I'll do the same on the other side. Now that that's done, I'm going to flip the part over. And we're going to gently bring the edges together. It's still a little bit springy, but I believe we're going to be able to work with it. When I bring the two edges together, it's going to be very important that these two corners up front are lined up. If they're stair-stepped like this, that's going to give us some problems. Now that we've got our test fit, let's go tear off 5 or 6 pieces of masking tape. We're almost ready to glue this together. Now we've got some tape on standby. Let's bring the two edges together. What I've discovered works best is I'll lay one piece of tape right across one edge. I'll bring it right up to the edge, fold it back, and crease it. Next, I'm going to bring the two edges together. I want to make sure I'm lined up front. Now, using my fingertips, I'm going to press directly on the seam. Now, I'm carefully going to bring the tape across the seam. And you can see that I've got a little bit of a gap. I'm going to bring the tape back, pull the edges together a second time, and pull the tape across. I'm going to check to make sure my edges are even. You can see I've got a little bit of a stair step, so I'm going to pull the tape up a third time, and I'm going to reposition it just slightly and pull my tape back across. That looks really good. Next, I'm going to apply a bead of glue to one side or the other. I'm kind of prying the seam apart just a little bit. And you can see I'm not going all the way down to my tape. I'm going to push the side down that has the glue, and then using a wiping motion, I'm going to push the other side down. This is going to swipe some excess glue down inside the cavity. You can see I've got a little bit of excess there, so using a piece of scrap, I'm going to wipe away this glue that's beaded up. I'm going to apply some tape across the seam as the glue is cooling. Now I'm going to check all the way here on the end. I want to see how easily these two edges come together. That is not too bad. It's a little bit springy, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of tape here across the very end. And I'm going to pull this piece of tape loose here in the middle. I'm going to shoot glue inside this crack. We're going to get a little bit of buildup here, so you'll want to have some scrap on standby once you shoot the glue into the seam. Do your best to keep it right there inside the seam. And be really careful here that you don't burn your fingers. I'm going to push the side down that has glue and then the other side. If the glue is coming out, use a piece of scrap to bring the two sides together. Quickly remove your scrap before it sticks to the skin. You'll see that I'm putting pressure directly on the seam. That'll really help the two edges come together flush. As the glue's cooling, I'm going to pull this piece of tape loose. Apply a little glue right along this seam. Wipe away the excess, and I'm going to pull that tape tight. And make sure my tape is secured. We can flip this over and do a test fit with our former. Now that we've got the two edges glued together, we're going to do a test fit between the F5 former and the C5 tail skin. You can see that our planning paid off. You can see that our shape is fairly close. Now you'll see that this corner and this corner look a little bit more square than the former. That's okay. It's going to stretch just a little bit. We're going to get a really good fit here. I'm going to line up the crop mark at the bottom of the former to the seam on the bottom of the skin, and I'm gently going to fit the former in. It's a little bit snug up here at the top, so I want to remove a little bit more material. As a rule of thumb, I always like to have the former fit just slightly loose. The former fit really well, except from about here, over the top, and down about the same distance. I'm going to use a razor blade and cut a small bevel. With the bevel cut, I'm going to line up the crop mark at the bottom once again and push the former in. That fits perfectly. And as always, unless otherwise indicated, whenever you insert a former, you're always going to have one layer of foam sticking out all the way around. Now that we've done our test fit, we're going to pull the former back out, and then we're going to apply glue to the inside of the skin and reinsert the former. I'm double checking that my crop mark is lined up exactly with the seam. You can see that I've got a loose fit, which is just what I want. I'm looking to make sure that my former is sticking out one layer of foam. All right, that looks good. I'm going to hold this in place for a full minute and a half while the glue cools down. Once a former has been glued in place, let's look at our symbol mapping. If you look here, you see a razor blade cutting a dotted line. Now that the assembly is done, we're going to cut along the dotted line. Once you've cut through all three layers, use a barbecue skewer and pull out the center scrap. Now that the center scrap's been removed, let's test fit our H1 spline. To test fit our H1 spline, I'm simply going to push it straight into the tail assembly. I'm going to push it down until it makes contact with the table down here. You'll notice that I've got H1 down here at the bottom. I want to make sure it's oriented correctly and that it's not flipped upside down. Now that we've got our test fit, we're going to pull the spline out and apply glue to the bottom and the top and then reinsert it. To get the spline out, I'm going to put a finger on either side of the spline on the former. I'm going to pull straight up. I'm going to apply a bead of glue along the top and a bead of glue on the bottom. And we're going to reinsert. Make sure you push it all the way down until it makes contact with the table. Using a piece of scrap, I'm going to remove any glue that's above the former. Next, we're going to apply a bead of glue where the spline meets the former. We'll apply a bead of glue to both sides. Let's let that cool down before moving on. If you have a dotted line on the tail section of your aircraft, once you get the spline installed, this is when you cut along the dotted line using a razor blade. Some models will have a dotted line while others will not. Make sure you keep your tail section vertical. You will need to hold your razor blade parallel to the tabletop. Now that we've got the spline glued in place, it's very important that we go ahead and run the pushrod housing. If we go on to the next section and add the former and add the next spline without adding the pushrod housing, it'll be very difficult to slide the pushrod housing through two formers and then this hole way back here in the back. So let's run a pushrod housing now. I'm simply going to run it through the hole or the slot. Using a pushrod, I'm going to catch the end of the pushrod housing, lift up just slightly and push the pushrod housing out about 1/4 inch. Add a little blob of glue right there. Let that cool, then we'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Make sure that you do not cut off your pushrod housing. We'll do that after we complete the tail section. Once the two pushrod housings have been glued in place, locate your next tail section. Before installing the next segment, let's take a couple minutes and let's go over the symbol mapping. If you look up here, we've got C5 underlined. Since it's underlined, that indicates that is the part we are working on. We see that on this edge, we're going to be going over a former labeled F5. So if we look over here, we can see that this is the F5 former. And if you remember, right down the middle, we've got a pretty tight bend. If we look down here on this end, again, we see C5 underlined. Since it's underlined, that indicates that's the part we're working on. We see a former, and the former we're going to be going over is labeled F4. We look at our former here, and we see that it's the F4. Now you'll notice that this former is square, whereas the F5 former is round. That's going to come into play after we tear our paper off and we map out how we're going to add shape. We'll go over that in a minute. One thing I want to touch on before we move on is if you look up here, you're going to see a familiar symbol. This is the peel paper from the foam symbol. But you're going to see another symbol right here. This is our glue and wrap symbol. Now, I've got a couple pieces of scrap. I want to give you a visual of what that symbol is all about. We came up with the glue and wrap symbol because it's very difficult to line two edges up along a curve. So if you look at this scrap that I have in my hand, you'll see that we've just glued a little bit and wrapped it around. Anytime that you're gluing a curve together, it's always best to do it in sections. You just apply a little glue, wrap the part, let it cool, add some glue, wrap the part, and let it cool. I'll demonstrate here. You can see that I've already glued about 1/3 of the edge together. I'm going to add a little bit of glue here in the middle. I'm going to wrap the part just a little bit more. And I want you to see that the edges are coming together. So I've glued and then I've wrapped. I'm going to hold this in place for about 1.5 minutes, and then we're going to glue the final section. You're going to see the glue and wrap repeated over and over and over in upcoming videos. So if you didn't catch exactly what we're doing, you'll see it demonstrated over and over again. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to apply a small amount of glue to the remaining edge. And I'm going to wrap the two parts together where I get a good looking seam. I'll hold it in place while the glue cools down. Now that we've gone over the symbols, let's remove the paper. Now that we've got the paper removed, we need to come up with a plan of attack. If you remember, the F4 former is squared off on top, the F5 former is rounded. Let's begin by lining up the center mark on the former to the center mark on the skin. I'm going to put a mark here at the corner and another mark at the other corner. Somewhere between here and here, we go from a very defined squared edge to a nice, smooth, rounded shape. Using a ruler, I'm going to put a slight taper in here. I'll do the same on the other side. It doesn't have to be exact. Don't worry about it needing to be too precise. We just need to get it close. The formers shoved in either end will really help stretch the skins the way that it's needed. What we're trying to do though is just get the very basic shape. Now that we've got the center marked, you'll notice on this one that I've got a notch. Now if it comes to a point, you can simply do what we've done before. You line up this crop mark to the edge and we roll it backwards. But since there's a big notch here, what we're going to have to do is we're going to start here in the center. We're going to roll it. And you can see from here to here, it's pretty flat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little mark right here, because what we want to do is we want to add some shape along this curve right here. I'm taking and roll it a little bit more. And I'm going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. Now what we're going to do is simply add a little bit of shape through here. And you'll notice I'm not going all the way back. And I want to show you why. If we look over here at our F5 former, you can see we've got shape here and we've got shape down here at the corner. Here in the middle, it's fairly flat. What I want to do is I want to take the F5 former and I want to line it up on the center line. And I'm going to slightly roll it to this mark right here. And if you remember, we used that mark earlier. Do the same on the other side. Put it right in the center and roll it. We're going to roll it till the former starts to flatten out. We're going to be adding a little bit of shape right along here. Now that we've got our marks, let's start adding some shape to this. Now that we've got the skin marked, I'm going to begin here in the center. I'm first going to form a crease right along this line. Since we've got a very hard break looking at our former, I'm going to bend this straight over. I'm not going to push it all the way down to the table. You can see I've got a small gap right here. If I push too hard, I will get a crinkle. Since we know that the former is squared here at the top, but it's rounded here at the bottom, I'm applying most of my pressure up here along the leading edge. I have a pretty hard break going all the way back, but it's not quite as hard as it is up here at the front. Once I get that break made, I'm going to line up the other mark and I'm going to fold it over. Again, I'm applying pressure from about the midpoint forward. Now you can see when I fold it up, that pretty well mimics the shape of the former. Looks like I got my line in just a little bit too far. You're going to make mistakes like this from time to time, and it's really no big deal. We're simply going to adjust the bend. So those two lines were a little bit too close together. I'm simply going to drop it down about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch. And I'm going to redo my bend. Working with foam is very, very forgiving. Okay, let's do a test fit. You can see that that's a lot better. We can work with that. So here in the back, we know we've got a pretty tight radius. If you look at it this way, and I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but I can see a fairly defined line. But we learned before that it's really easy to get rid of those lines by simply dragging them over the tabletop while applying pressure. I'm going to do that from about here to about the midpoint. That way we'll have a transition here at the tail to more square up here towards the front of the skin. Learning how to read formers is going to make your builds look fantastic. What we're hoping to do is make you the best builder that you can possibly be. Now that we've got the center section done, let's add a little bit of shape in this area here. I'm simply going to apply pressure with my hand, draw it down. Yep, I'm right in the right area. I'm going to move my hand over just a little bit and do it one more time. So you can see that we've added just a little bit of shape. So let's see how that works out. So here's my former. There we go. Let's do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've got the center in the section here and here, let's add some shape along here. I'm going to make a bend, draw it, make another bend, draw it, make another bend, draw it towards me. I'm going to bring it back and apply pressure and draw it off the table to smooth out those hard lines. I'm going to push the edge down on the tabletop, fold it over. Again, make sure that you don't apply pressure to where you crinkle the skin. You can see that there's still a pretty good gap, but by holding it in place like this for a few seconds, it'll really break down that foam. And when you go to bring the two edges together, it's going to be much, much easier. Now let's do the same on the other side. Now that we've added shape, let's do a test fit onto the rear tail section, and then we're going to start gluing things in place. Next, we're going to do a test fit. There's a couple things that I want to point out before we do our actual test fit. If you look right here in the center, right by the crop mark, you're going to see an arrowhead. Since this is a glue and wrap part, this arrow indicates where you begin the gluing process. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to line up this crop mark to this crop mark. When we go to glue, I'm going to apply a bead of glue across the top of the spine, and I'm going to glue about a 1/2 inch on either side of the spline on top of the former that's been exposed. When bringing the two parts together, we're going to shingle the part that you're adding over the top of the part that we're gluing to. If you look here, you can see a paper layer. The way these kits have been designed is there's going to be a shingling of the paper just slightly over the paper here in the back. So I'm going to line up the crop marks. You can see that my paper is shingling over this part. And I'm going to bend this down. Now you can see a pretty good step right there. I don't like the way that looks. So we're actually going to remove a little bit of material on the former so this drops down and fits a little bit better. The reason I always like my formers to fit loosely is if they get too tight, you're going to get that stair step that I just showed you. But if you have a stair step and you want to get rid of it, it's a piece of cake. All you do is remove a little bit of foam right along the top of the former. We're just going to remove a little bit of foam from the top of the spline. Looks like I got a little bit of glue that might have been causing our problem. All right, with the glue removed, let's try our test fit again. There we go. So we're shingling this piece over the top of this piece just slightly, and I'm going to push it down with my fingertips. Check out that edge. That looks great. Test fit looks good. Apply a bead of glue and a small amount of glue on either side of the spline. I'm doing a little bit less than a 1/2 inch. Let's bring the two edges together. Remember to shingle. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. I want to make sure this first section is completely cooled down. You do not want this to shift. Now that we've got the first section glued, we're going to continue to glue and wrap until we come all the way to the center. And then we're going to glue and wrap the other side until we join edges here at the center. So let's do a test fit. I'm going to wrap this around. And it looks like my edge looks really good up to the point where my thumb is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a bead of glue from here up to about here. When you're doing the glue and wrap, sometimes you can only go a 1/2 inch at a time. Sometimes you can go 2 or 3 inches. It all depends on the shape that you're creating. You will quickly get a feel for this. So we've glued and wrapped this around. I'm going to hold this for 2 minutes while the glue cools down. If you just do a real short segment each time, you can always ensure that your seam looks perfect. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, let's glue and wrap the final section. I'm going to do a test fit first. And remember, this side is shingling over this side. I'm going to bring it together, and I'm going to bring the edge to the center line between the two halves of the spline. That looks good. Along the top of the former, and I'm going to apply a bead of glue on one side of the spline. I'm going to wrap it, and just like before, I'm going to hold it in place for about 2 minutes, giving the glue plenty of time to cool down. You can see I've got glue squirting out, so I'm going to remove all the excess using scrap. Do your best to get all the glue. Before we glue the next side, I want to explain what's going to happen. Once we get this side closed in, we're going to take our F4 former, we're going to run the push rod housings through the hole, and we're going to position the F4 former with one layer of foam sticking out. Once that's glued in place, we're going to use a razor blade and cut along the dotted lines. Once we cut along the dotted lines and remove the center, that's going to open up a channel for our spline. And if you remember back, we're going to have an edge-to-edge fit with our two splines. The H1 will be attaching edge-to-edge to the H2. So we'll get to that in just a minute. I kind of wanted to show you how things were going to come together before I close this other side. Before I add glue, I'm going to do a test fit. That looks really good. I'm going to add glue from here to about here, like I did on the other side. Hold this in place for 2 minutes, and then we'll do the final segment. Now that the glue's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to close this up. It looks like I'm getting a little bit of interference, and that's okay. I'm just going to run my razor blade right along this edge and create a little bit of a bevel. That bevel cut, it just come together really, really well. Just like before, I'm going to add glue along the former and across 1/2 of the spline. Our seam looks really good. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. You'll notice that we still have a gap in front of the spline. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these two edges together and I'm going to press down right along the seam with my fingertips. I'm going to run a piece of tape across it. And I'm going to add more tape going towards the back of the tail. All right. Once I've done that and I look at my edge and I see that the seam looks good, I'm going to roll it over. It's going to be a little bit difficult to show this on the camera, but you can see when I press down that it opens up a channel. I'm going to jam the nose of my glue gun into that and fill that gap from back to front with glue. While the glue's cooling down, I'm going to press down slightly. Hold this in place for a full 2 minutes. Make sure that seam has plenty of time to cool down. Once that seam's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to run the push rod housings through the holes on the former. Next, I'm going to slide the former in place. I'm going to slide it back to where there's only one layer of foam sticking out. Make sure that the crop mark here at the top is lined up with the crop mark on the former, and I'm going to squeeze the sides together. All right, that looks good. Now it's going to be very difficult to apply glue all the way around the skin like we've done in other examples. So I'm going to apply a small amount of glue here at the top along the back two formers there at the top. And I'm going to line up the crop mark, push it down right in the middle. I'm going to hold this for 2 minutes while the glue cools. Then we'll work our way around one side and then around the other. Now that I've got the top secured, I'm going to squeeze one side down to the former, and it looks like I've got good fit from the top all the way to the edge. So I'm going to slightly pry open the skin, apply a bead of glue, and push the skin down in place. If you got excess glue, make sure and wipe it away. It's really important to wipe that excess glue away. If you don't, you're going to have to probably cut it away. Otherwise, you're going to get a stair step between the two parts. Let this cool a couple minutes like we did at the top. Then we're going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. We're getting really close to getting this tail section completed. Let's do the same on this side. First, I'm going to check to make sure it's going to fit. That looks really good. Once this cools down, we're going to cut the slot for the spline. Now that we've got the former glued in place, our symbol mapping tells us we need to use a razor blade and cut down the dotted lines like we did on the previous segment. Once the scrap's been removed from the center, let's test fit our H2 spline. I'm going to run it down until it butts up against the H1 spline. Okay, our fit looks really good. And one thing I want to point out is I've got the seam running along the bottom right here. And if I rotate the assembly, you'll see that this is right reading. If your letters are flipped the other way, you know you've got it in upside down. So just like before, I'm going to put the end of the tail on the tabletop. I'm going to press down on the former, one finger on either side. I'm going to pull the spline straight up. Next, I'm going to apply a bead of glue here and a bead of glue here. Since we're going to be bringing two edges together, I'm also going to run a bead of glue right here. Be really careful you don't burn yourself on this step. There you go. Push it down, and now we're going to run a bead of glue on this side and one on the other side. Once the glue cools down, we're going to cut the push rod housings. Since this particular aircraft has a two-segment section, we can now cut the push rod housing. I'm going to make a cut here along the top, about a ½ inch from where the push rod housing comes through the former. Make a little cut and then bend it 90 degrees. Flip it around. I'm going to do the same on the other side. With that, we have now covered a two-segment tail section. The advantage of symbol mapping and build consistency really comes into play on the tail sections of our aircraft. You have seen both a single segment and two-segment example. Some of our aircraft actually have 3 or even 4 segments. Because of simple mapping and build consistency, adding a third section is just a repeat of adding the second section. The builder will simply locate the next sequential skin, identify the front and back former, add the shape, follow the glue and wrap procedure, seal the bottom, and install the formers and spline. If there happens to be a 4th skin, you just simply repeat that step once again. If I haven't mentioned it before, after building 1 or 2 of these aircraft, you are going to be an expert builder.